Are you really free, or do you just think you are? Every day, we follow rules, obey laws, and accept social norms without questioning them. But what happens when the order that keeps society stable starts to suffocate your freedom? In this video, we're going to reveal the invisible but brutal conflict between your individual freedom and society's need for control. Get ready. What you're about to hear might change the way you see the world and yourself. We live in societies full of rules, laws, and power structures. But why do we accept being governed? And at what point does the state protect our freedom? And when does it become our oppressor? This tension between freedom and control isn't new. Since the beginning of political philosophy, thinkers have tried to answer this question in very different ways. Here, we're going to explore three major perspectives: John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Confucius. Each one offers a unique way to understand the fragile balance between individual freedom and collective order. John Locke, the state as a protector of natural rights. John Locke, a 17th century English philosopher, is one of the fathers of modern liberalism. For him, freedom isn't something the state gives you, it's something you're born with. Locke believed every human being has three basic rights that can't be taken away: life, liberty, and property. Locke argued that in the state of nature, meaning before governments existed, people were free, but that freedom was always at risk because of conflict and insecurity. So, people chose to create civil societies and governments to protect those rights, not to limit them. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. John Locke, Second Treatise of Government. That quote reveals something important. For Locke, real freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means living with the confidence that your life, your property, and your personal independence will be respected. The role of the state, then, is to provide safety and step in only when those rights are threatened. Any government that goes beyond that, controlling your conscience, religion, or property, becomes a form of tyranny. Locke strongly influenced the US Constitution and modern democracies. He helped shape the idea of universal human rights. But is his optimistic view of human nature enough to keep society stable? Thomas Hobbes. The state as a necessary force against chaos. Thomas Hobbes, also English and a contemporary of Locke, saw things very differently. He lived through the English Civil War, a violent and chaotic period, and that shaped his worldview. For Hobbes, human nature isn't naturally peaceful. It's a constant state of threat, driven by distrust, fear, and competition. He described this condition with a famous line: "Man is a wolf to man." Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. To avoid a war of everyone against everyone, Hobbes argued that people must give up part of their freedom and hand it over to a sovereign authority, the Leviathan, a symbolic figure of the state with absolute power, strong enough to enforce order. Hobbes didn't believe in natural rights the way Locke did. For him, freedom without government leads to chaos. The state's job isn't just to protect rights, it's to impose peace, even if that means limiting individual freedom. This raises a question that still matters today. How much power is too much power? In times of crisis, like pandemics, wars, or social breakdown, governments often become more controlling in the name of safety. Hobbes would say that's necessary. Locke would probably call it a threat to freedom. That tension is still alive in modern debates about public safety, government surveillance, and civil rights. Confucius, order through virtue and harmony. But there's also a third perspective, one from the East, that focuses less on rights and more on virtue and harmony. Confucius, a Chinese thinker from the 5th century BC, didn't talk about the state the same way Western philosophers did. Still, his view of society became one of the most influential political ideas in Eastern history. For Confucius, social order doesn't come mainly from laws or pure individual freedom. It comes from moral hierarchy, a society that works like a big family where everyone understands their role and acts with respect and responsibility. To govern is to correct. Confucius, Analects. That line captures his ideal. A ruler should lead by moral example. If the ruler is just and virtuous, people will follow naturally, not out of fear of punishment, but out of respect. Confucius didn't support uncontrolled individual freedom. To him, real freedom comes from self-discipline, moral education, and personal growth. A society where everyone acts only out of self-interest, like Hobbes feared, will fall into disorder. But a society where everyone does whatever they want without thinking about the common good can't reach harmony either. This way of thinking still shapes many Asian cultures today, where the collective is often valued more than the individual. A successful society is measured by harmony, not only by personal freedom. 3 different worlds. So we have 3 very different philosophical views. Locke, who sees the state as the protector of natural individual freedom and basic rights. Hobbes, who sees the state as a necessary force to prevent chaos, even if it costs freedom. Confucius, who sees society as a moral system where order comes from virtue, not strict laws or unlimited freedom. These ideas help explain why different societies choose different paths and why conflicts appear between them. For example, the US model of government, built on individual rights and distrust of state power, is deeply rooted in Locke's tradition. More authoritarian systems that justify control in the name of stability reflect Hobbes's logic, and countries like China, Japan, and South Korea still carry strong Confucian influence with a focus on discipline, respect for authority, and prioritizing the collective. But the question remains, which of these views creates a more fair and dignified life for everyone? When freedom becomes chaos, and when order becomes a prison. Today, we live in a paradox. We talk about freedom more than ever, but we're also more regulated than ever. From what we can say on social media to how we move through our cities, everything is shaped by some form of control, whether from the state, from corporations, or from social pressure. And when crises happen, pandemics, wars, environmental collapse, the balance usually shifts toward order. We start accepting restrictions in exchange for safety. But where is the limit? Maybe the real answer is leaving the extremes behind. Locke reminds us that the individual must be respected. Hobbes reminds us that order is necessary for freedom to exist at all. And Confucius challenges us to find balance, not through force, but through virtue. Freedom of speech is often seen as the foundation of any free society. But does allowing anything to be said, no matter the cost, strengthen society or threaten it? The tension between the right to speak freely and the need to preserve collective harmony is one of the oldest issues in political philosophy, and it still shapes today's debates. Let's look at this dilemma through the lens of John Stuart Mill, Plato, and Han Feizi. 3 thinkers from different cultures and time periods, but all connected by the same question. How far can speech go before it becomes dangerous? John Stuart Mill, almost unlimited freedom of speech. John Stuart Mill, a 19th century English philosopher, is one of the strongest defenders of free speech. In On Liberty, 1859, Mill argues that freedom of opinion should be almost absolute, not only because it's an individual right, but because society as a whole benefits from open debate. Mill starts with a powerful idea. Human beings are not infallible. If we silence an opinion just because it seems wrong, we're taking away humanity's chance to find the truth. And even if the opinion really is false, it still has value, because when it's challenged, it helps the truth become stronger and clearer. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not deprive others of theirs. John Stuart Mill warns that silencing people is always harmful because it kills debate. Without debate, there is no critical thinking. And without critical thinking, society becomes weak, easy to manipulate, and stuck. Mill's historical context matters too. He lived during the Industrial Revolution and major democratic changes across Europe. He saw how new ideas, often unpopular or offensive at the time, opened the door for real progress. He defended women's rights, the end of slavery, and secularism, all controversial topics in his era. Today, in the age of the internet and social media, Mill's ideas feel more relevant than ever, but also harder to apply. If everything can be posted and shared instantly, how do we deal with hate speech, misinformation, or attacks on democracy? Does near-total freedom of speech still work in this world? That concern isn't new. Centuries earlier, Plato was already worried about how destructive speech could become. Plato: not every type of speech should be allowed. Plato, a Greek philosopher from the 4th century BC, viewed freedom of speech with deep caution. In the Republic, he imagines an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings, wise leaders trained to seek truth and maintain order. For Plato, not every kind of speech should be permitted. He believed certain types of stories and ideas, especially false myths and immoral narratives, could corrupt people's souls and destabilize the polis, the city-state. In his education model, he even suggests censoring some of Homer's poems because they portray the gods as immoral, which could damage the moral development of young people. We must suppress stories that show the gods fighting, lying, or acting unjustly. Plato, the Republic. Plato understood the power of words to stir emotions, deceive, and manipulate. In his view, a good society can't afford to let dangerous or dishonest speech spread freely. What should be allowed must be guided by truth and the common good. On one hand, this can sound like an attack on individual freedom, but on the other, it highlights a real concern. Words shape character, and if the collective mind is poisoned by lies and appeals to the lowest instincts, the whole society suffers. We see similar debates today. Should we ban fake news, block hate speech, regulate algorithms that push conspiracy theories? In times of extreme polarization, Plato's ideas come back strong. Maybe not every form of speech is harmless, but there's a third approach, even stricter, coming from ancient Chinese political thought. Han Feizi, a key figure of legalism. Han Feizi, speech as a threat to the state. Han Feizi was a Chinese philosopher from the 3rd century BC and one of the most important representatives of legalism, a school of thought that opposed Confucianism and defended strict laws, surveillance, and harsh punishments to guarantee stability. In Han Feizi's view, freedom of speech is not something to protect. It's a danger to a ruler's authority. To maintain order, the state must eliminate rebellious speech, rival ideologies, and any influence that could create distrust toward the established power. A wise ruler must control the speech of his subjects because disorder begins with the tongue. Han Feizi. The core idea of legalism is simple. People don't need to understand the government. They only need to obey it. The ruler cannot be questioned without threatening public order. Stability comes from centralized control, including control over what ideas are allowed to spread. This philosophy influenced the creation of the Chinese Empire under the Qin dynasty. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, a follower of legalism, reportedly ordered books to be burned and intellectuals who disagreed with the official ideology to be punished. Even today, this mindset echoes in regimes that place social unity above individual freedom, using censorship and information control as necessary tools to protect the state and prevent what they see as the chaos of public opinion. So the question becomes, how much peace does controlling speech actually create? And when does it destroy the human spirit? The modern problem. Everyone has a voice, but not everyone has responsibility. We live in a time when freedom of speech has never been easier and never been more complicated. Everyone has a voice, but not everyone has responsibility. Social media amplifies opinions, but it also twists them, inflames emotions, and divides people. At the same time, governments and tech companies are trying to control what can and can't be said. Fake news, hate speech, medical misinformation, and political manipulation are treated as real threats. But where does regulation end, and where does censorship begin? This is where the conflict between Mill, Plato, and Han Feizi shows up in real life. Mill warns us about the danger of silencing even the most ridiculous ideas. Plato reminds us that speech is not always harmless or neutral, and Han Feizi reveals how tempting total control becomes for those in power. So what kind of society do we want? A society where anything can be said, even if it destroys social unity? Or a society that values stability, even if it means limiting what people can say? The debate over free speech isn't simple. It requires maturity, responsibility, and judgment, because too much freedom without standards can break a society, but too much control without open debate can also destroy it. Mill invites us to trust reason and open argument. Plato invites us to think about the moral impact of words. Han Feizi reminds us that power fears speech, and that's why it always tries to control it. And you? Do you believe freedom of speech should be total, or should it have limits to protect society? Comment below, is speech a bridge to truth, or a weapon that can destroy order? Few topics stir up emotions as deeply as religion. For many people, it's a source of meaning, morality, and belonging. For others, it can become a tool for intolerance, conflict, and control. Human history is marked by both powerful acts of faith and brutal wars and persecutions fueled by belief. That's where a major dilemma appears. Should religion be controlled to maintain social order, or should it be free, even if it risks dividing society? Three voices stand out in this debate: Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and Mahatma Gandhi. Each one offers a unique view on the role religion plays in both public life and personal life. And more than ever, these ideas matter in a world where different faiths living side by side has become a constant test of social maturity. Rousseau, religion as a source of unity, but also a risk. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an 18th century Swiss philosopher, lived in a time when religion was deeply tied to political power. In The Social Contract, 1762, Rousseau presents a controversial but powerful idea: the creation of a civil religion. This civil religion isn't about one specific faith. Instead, it would be a basic set of symbolic and moral beliefs meant to unite the people and strengthen loyalty to the nation. Rousseau believed traditional religion could divide society because it creates a double loyalty between citizens and spiritual authority. But a well-balanced civil religion could create social unity, a shared identity, and obedience to the law. It is impossible to live in peace with people you believe are condemned to hell. Rousseau, The Social Contract. That quote reveals his fear that religions claiming to be the only truth can produce intolerance and division. That's why Rousseau argued the state has the right to suppress religions that threaten public order, not because of what they believe, but because of the social consequences they create. So Rousseau stands somewhere in the middle. He's not defending full religious repression, but he's also not promoting unlimited freedom. His view is practical. Religion should serve the common good. And if it stops doing that, becoming fanatic or hostile to the state, it should be restrained. In the modern world, you can still see traces of this in secular countries that keep religious holidays, civic symbols, and public rituals with spiritual roots. It's a way of using religion's power to unite people without letting it control the law. But many people don't trust that kind of state influence over faith, and one of the strongest critics of religious control was Voltaire. Voltaire, total freedom of belief and religious tolerance. Voltaire, an 18th century French philosopher, was one of the greatest defenders of freedom of conscience and religious tolerance. In Treatise on Tolerance, 1763, he fiercely condemns crimes committed in the name of religion, especially the Catholic fanaticism of his time. Voltaire believed every person should have the right to believe, or not believe, whatever they want, without being persecuted, discriminated against, or forced by the state. To him, religious diversity wasn't a threat to order. It was actually a protection against fanaticism. When there are many beliefs, none can easily dominate everyone else. I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Viti, often attributed to Voltaire. Even though that quote is more famous than historically precise, it captures the spirit of his philosophy. For Voltaire, religious freedom is a core part of human dignity, and a state that tries to shape its citizens' faith crosses the limits of legitimate power. Voltaire also distrusted Rousseau's idea of a civil religion. In his view, any attempt to unify belief in the name of stability could easily become a new form of oppression. Instead, he believed in reason, open dialogue, and a secular government. Today, his influence is clear in liberal democracies, where freedom of religion is protected by law and the state stays neutral toward belief. Still, living together with different religions or with atheism remains a challenge. How do we balance freedom with the responsibility to respect others? That's where a third perspective comes in, from the East. Mahatma Gandhi, a spiritual and political leader who showed through real action how religious tolerance can become a path to peace. Gandhi, peace through mutual respect between faiths. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India's independence movement in the 20th century, lived in a country shaped by intense religious diversity: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and many others. Unlike Rousseau and Voltaire, Gandhi didn't write philosophical books. He lived his philosophy through nonviolent resistance and commitment to a plural society. For Gandhi, real social order doesn't come from forcing one religion on everyone, and it doesn't come from controlling other people's faith. It comes from spiritual growth, compassion, and deep respect between traditions. Religions are different paths leading to the same point. What matters is following your path sincerely. Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi supported the idea of Sarvadharma Sambhava, which means the equal respect of all religion. He believed every faith carries universal values and truths, and because of that, no religion should ever be imposed or banned. Peace is only possible when it's built on real acceptance of religious diversity. During violent conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi would fast as a protest against the bloodshed, appealing to the moral conscience of the people. He became living proof that religious coexistence is possible, but it requires humility, dialogue, and forgiveness. His vision is still rare in the modern world. Many governments claim to be secular but still favor one dominant religion. Others impose one religion and suppress the rest. Gandhi shows that true religious freedom only exists when mutual respect is stronger than the desire to be right. So what does this teach us? These three perspectives, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Gandhi, offer different ways to understand religion's role in society. Rousseau sees religion as a tool for unity, but warns about its power to divide. Voltaire demands a complete separation between faith and political power to protect individual freedom. Gandhi believes genuine respect between religions is the only true foundation for peace, but the modern world shows how far we still are from finding that balance. In many countries, religious minorities are still persecuted. In others, the dominant religion tries to set rules for everyone, shaping politics and education. And there are also cases where religious freedom is used as an excuse for intolerance, like hate speech disguised as belief. So the dilemma remains: should religion be regulated to protect society, or should it be completely free, even if it creates conflict? Faith. A bridge or a wall? What these thinkers teach us is that religion can be both a bridge and a wall. It can connect people through shared values, or separate them through dogma and exclusion. It depends on how religion is lived, interpreted, and placed inside society. Faith can guide people toward peace, like Gandhi believed. It can become a tool of oppression, as Voltaire feared. Or it can be used by the state as a tool for unity, like Rousseau suggested. Do you believe religion should be completely free, even if that means living with conflict? Or should there be some kind of control to protect social unity? Since the birth of human societies, the individual has faced a constant tension. Stand out as your own person, or dissolve into the group. Live for yourself, or live for others. Chase personal freedom, or accept collective responsibility. This conflict between individualism and collectivism isn't just political, it's existential. It shapes our choices, our cultures, and our systems of government. Throughout history, thinkers have tried to answer this dilemma. Three of them, Ayn Rand, Karl Marx, and Zhuangzi, represent radically different perspectives from completely different philosophical worlds, but together, they help reveal a tension that still defines our time. Ayn Rand, the individual comes first. Ayn Rand, a 20th century Russian-American philosopher and novelist, is one of the most extreme voices in defense of individualism. As the creator of objectivism, Rand believed that the individual, guided by reason and rational self-interest, is the only true foundation of morality. For her, society only has value when it respects the individual's freedom to pursue their own happiness. In her most famous novel, Atlas Shrugged, 1957, Rand creates characters who embody this worldview: innovators, entrepreneurs, creators who refuse to sacrifice themselves for the collective. She condemned any system that demands a person give up who they are in the name of some vague, greater good. The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. Ayn Rand. To Rand, collectivism, whether through socialism, forced altruism, or any kind of community ideal that demands sacrifice, is always a threat. It demands obedience, conformity, and self-denial, and worse, it often becomes a moral excuse to control, exploit, or destroy anyone who dares to think for themselves. Her ideas inspire many people who feel personal autonomy is under attack. Individuals pressured by social expectations, government bureaucracy, or ideologies that try to make everyone the same. In an age of increasing surveillance, cancel culture, and centralized control, Rand is remembered as a fierce defender of absolute freedom, even an uncompromising. But her view has a blind spot. What if the individual isn't free because they were born into a system that limits them from the start? That's the heart of Karl Marx's critique. Karl Marx, no one is free in an unjust system. Karl Marx, a 19th century German philosopher, is the classic critic of liberal individualism. For him, extreme focus on the individual hides the reality of the social systems that shape and restrict our choices. No one is truly born free in a world built on deep inequality. Marx saw capitalist society as divided into classes. On one side, the owners of production; on the other, workers who become alienated from their own humanity. The promise of individual freedom becomes an illusion when a large part of the population lives under economic pressure without real access to opportunity or self-determination. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. Karl Marx. For Marx, real freedom can only exist when social classes are overcome, when the means of production are collectively controlled and work is no longer just survival. Only then can the individual truly grow and thrive, not as an isolated ego, but as a social being living in balance with others. His ideas fueled revolutionary movements all over the world, aiming to build more equal societies, but attempts to apply his vision often led to authoritarian regimes that, ironically, crushed both the collective and the individual. Modern criticism of Marx points to exactly this. In trying to free people from structural oppression, collectivism can end up replacing one form of domination with another, more disguised, but still oppressive. That's where a third voice enters, quieter, more spiritual, offering a completely different approach, a detachment from both sides of the debate. Zhuangzi, freedom beyond, both individual and group. Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher from 4th century BC China, wasn't focused on political systems or social structures. For him, both individualism and collectivism can become traps if they turn into rigid demands. In his work, Zhuangzi, he presents a worldview where the wise person doesn't cling to a fixed identity and doesn't dissolve into the crowd either. Instead, they follow the Tao, the natural flow of the universe, and live in harmony with it, moving with life instead of fighting it. The perfect man has no self. Zhuangzi. At first, that phrase sounds strange, but the meaning is powerful. Freedom isn't found in pushing your ego against others or surrendering yourself to the group. It's found in letting go of the need to constantly define yourself, control everything, or prove you belong. It's a quiet, inner freedom that doesn't depend on outside approval. Zhuangzi uses stories and metaphors to criticize people who cling too hard to logic, strict morality, or social rules. In one of his most famous parables, he dreams he is a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he doesn't know if he's a man who dreamed he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he's a man. The message, the boundaries between self and other, between individual and collective, are fragile constructions. In the modern world, Zhuangzi's philosophy speaks to people searching for inner freedom in the middle of external chaos. Instead of fighting for one fixed model of society, he invites us to look inward, to practice silence, spontaneity, and humility before the mystery of existence. 3 voices, 1 dilemma. Ayn Rand shouts, "Stand up for yourself, or the crowd will swallow you." Marx replies, "No one is free in an unfair world. Free the collective to free the individual." Zhuangzi whispers, "Let go of the idea of self, and you'll be truly free." These 3 perspectives reveal how complex the conflict between individualism and collectivism really is. Depending on the moment in your life, or in history, one can feel more convincing than the others. When oppression is crushing people, Rand's voice feels inspiring. When inequality is breaking society apart, Marx's critique gains power. And when people feel lost in endless polarization and ideological battles, Zhuangzi's calm perspective can feel like relief. But none of these views is a perfect solution. Each one carries risks. Extreme individualism can lead to selfishness, loneliness, and disconnection. Absolute collectivism can crush creativity and critical thinking. Rejecting both, as Zhuangzi suggests, can turn into apathy or doing nothing at all. And what about today's world? We live in a time where all these tensions collide. Western culture values personal independence, individual success, and freedom of choice. But it also faces global crises like climate change, inequality, and political instability that demand collective responses. At the same time, new movements are emerging that try to find balance. Intentional communities, cooperative economics, non-religious spirituality, collaborative networks. But there's also pushback. People who reject any kind of submission to the group, chasing total freedom, even if it isolates them. The dilemma remains. How do you stay free without disconnecting from others? And how do you belong without losing yourself? What happens when the law clashes with your conscience? When obedience stops being a virtue and becomes complicity? In times of oppression, silence can be cowardice. That leads to an uncomfortable but essential question. Is it legitimate to disobey in order to be just? The tension between legal order and moral justice runs through centuries of history. Some of the biggest changes humanity has ever seen, abolition, revolutions, civil rights, began with acts of disobedience. But not every act of disobedience is noble, and not every form of order is unjust. That's why understanding when, how, and why to disobey is one of the central questions in ethics and political philosophy. 3 key voices stand out in this debate: Henry David Thoreau, Martin Luther King Jr., and the ancient Bhagavad Gita. They represent 3 different perspectives on the conflict between duty, justice, and order. And together, they help us understand how someone can resist injustice without falling into chaos. Thoreau. Conscience comes before the law. Henry David Thoreau, a 19th century American writer and philosopher, was one of the first to clearly define the idea of civil disobedience. In his essay, Civil Disobedience, 1849, he argues that individuals have a moral duty to resist unjust laws, even if that means breaking with the state itself. Thoreau wrote this after being arrested for refusing to pay taxes that funded slavery and the Mexican-American War. For him, blindly obeying the law means giving up your conscience. Individual morality must come before legality. If the law requires me to be unjust to another, then I break the law. Thoreau wasn't promoting chaos. He believed a just society is built by citizens who think, judge, and act based on ethical principles, not fear of punishment. Real order, in his view, isn't blind obedience. It's the harmony between law and moral truth. His influence lasted far beyond his own time. His ideas inspired powerful, peaceful movements throughout the 20th century. One of the greatest examples was led by Martin Luther King Jr., who turned civil disobedience into a tool for justice. Martin Luther King Jr. Disobedience as a higher form of justice. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the US civil rights movement, took civil disobedience to a new level. In his famous text, Letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963, King argues that disobedience isn't a threat to order, it's a higher form of justice. King lived in a country where racial segregation was legal, but deeply immoral. He rejected violence, but he also refused to be passive. His mission was clear: disobey unjust laws with courage, dignity, and love. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. For King, there's a real difference between a just law and an unjust law. A just law matches moral law. An unjust law is one that degrades human dignity. Disobeying that kind of law isn't a crime, it's an act of conscience. Even more than that, King believed civil disobedience creates necessary pressure. It forces society to face its contradictions. Peaceful protest exposes the madness of oppression and invites the oppressor toward change and reflection. But King also warned, disobedience must be non-violent, public, and responsible. It's not random disorder, it's ethical action guided by a higher form of justice. This connects Thoreau to a spiritual tradition from India, where we find another way of understanding duty and right action. The Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita. Duty, truth, and inner clarity. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the most sacred texts in Hinduism, is a conversation between the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna, who guides him on the battlefield. Facing a war that includes his own family and loved ones, Arjuna hesitates. Krishna then teaches him about dharma, sacred duty, and calls him to act without attachment to results, but with awareness of his role in the larger order of existence. It is better to do your own duty imperfectly than to do someone else's duty perfectly. Bhagavad Gita 3:35. In the Gita, order isn't only social or legal, it's spiritual and universal. Every being has a role in the universe, and harmony comes when people act with balance and integrity. The focus isn't rebellion against human law, but alignment between action and inner truth. That doesn't mean blind submission. Krishna isn't telling Arjuna to obey any authority without thinking. He's telling him to act according to wisdom, inner clarity, and an ethical duty that goes beyond appearances. The Gita's biggest contribution is that it places the idea of order on a deeper level. Right action keeps the universe in balance. Disobedience can be just, but only when it's guided by inner clarity, awareness, and detachment from ego. What these three teach us. These three perspectives, Thoreau, King, and the Gita, show that disobedience can be a powerful moral act, as long as it's rooted in values deeper than anger or rebellion. They teach us that Thoreau trusts the judgment of individual conscience. King connects morality and politics, showing that unjust laws must be confronted with strength and love. The Gita reminds us that true duty comes from within and must align with a deeper order, not personal impulses or ideological obsession. In times of institutionalized injustice, these ideas inspire peaceful, ethical, and meaningful resistance. But they also demand responsibility, because disobedience without clarity, purpose, or preparation can create the opposite of what people want: chaos, fear, and repression. And what about today? Today, civil disobedience is still an urgent issue. Protests against authoritarian regimes, climate movements, human rights strikes, all of these carry echoes of those older traditions. But the world is more complicated now. In the age of social media, outrage is instant, but not always thoughtful. Many people confuse rebellion with virtue without thinking through the consequences. Others, in the name of order, try to crush any kind of protest, even when it's legitimate. That's why the lessons from these three pillars are even more relevant today. They don't tell us to obey or break the law automatically. They tell us to act with discernment. They remind us that true disobedience isn't against order itself. It's against the injustice hiding behind false order. History proves that the biggest changes happen when someone refuses to accept what should never be accepted. Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. Nelson Mandela resisting apartheid. Malala Yousafzai defending girls' education in the face of terror. In different ways, they all carry the legacy of Thoreau, King, and the Gita. They remind us that silence in the face of injustice is a form of agreement, and that real order doesn't come from passive obedience, but from the courage to act with conscience. Imagine living in a world where every step you take, every word you say, and even your thoughts could be monitored, where freedom is just an illusion and obedience isn't a choice, it's a quiet demand. Is that fiction? Or is it already part of our reality? The idea that the state watches and controls its citizens is old, but it has never felt as real as it does today. Cameras, algorithms, databases, social media. We're surrounded by surveillance systems that promise safety, but come at a high cost. And the inevitable question is, does state control protect us or trap us? Three philosophical perspectives can help us think through this: Michel Foucault, George Orwell, and legalist Confucian thinking. Each one, in their own way, gives us a key to understanding the fragile balance between order and freedom, surveillance and human dignity. Michel Foucault, control through constant observation. Michel Foucault, a 20th century French philosopher, is one of the most influential thinkers when it comes to understanding how power works in modern societies. In Discipline and Punish, 1975, Foucault argues that power is no longer mainly brutal or openly violent, like it was in older times. Instead, it has become subtle, invisible, and continuous, and it operates mainly through surveillance. Foucault describes what he calls a panoptic society, inspired by the prison model created by Jeremy Bentham, the panopticon. In that system, a guard in the center can watch all prisoners, but the prisoners never know for sure if they're being watched. And that uncertainty makes them control themselves. Surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action. Michel Foucault. According to Foucault, modern society works like one giant panopticon. Schools, hospitals, factories, social media, and of course the state, all act as control systems that discipline bodies and shape minds. Power doesn't need to force itself violently. It trains people, normalizes behavior, and creates acceptable standards. Foucault doesn't treat power as simply bad, but as something everywhere. We are constantly being shaped by norms, statistics, expectations, and invisible pressure. The state, through its institutions, is only one part of this machine, but it's an essential part. This view pushes us to look beyond laws and cameras. The deepest form of control isn't the one that forces you, it's the one that makes you accept what's forced on you. The most effective surveillance is the kind that makes people watch themselves. But what happens when control stops being subtle and becomes openly totalitarian? That's the nightmare George Orwell describes in a novel that feels more like a warning than fiction. George Orwell. When surveillance becomes totalitarian. George Orwell, a 20th century English writer, wrote one of the most disturbing and visionary books of modern literature, 1984. Published in 1949, the novel shows a society where the state controls everything: the past, language, emotions, and thoughts. In that world, freedom doesn't exist. only fear and submission. At the center of the regime is Big Brother, the symbol of a state that sees everything, knows everything, and punishes any kind of deviation. Surveillance is constant, cameras are everywhere, and even thinking differently becomes a crime, thought crime. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. George Orwell, 1984. Orwell shows what happens when surveillance stops being a tool and becomes a goal by itself: the destruction of humanity. In 1984, the individual has no space, no memory, and no truth. The state rewrites facts, erases dissidents, and even love is replaced by blind loyalty to the party. Even though it's fiction, 1984 has become painfully relevant. Today, personal data is collected constantly. AI systems analyze behavior. Governments and corporations can predict actions before they even happen. Orwell's warning isn't far away. It's in your pocket, in your apps, in the terms you accept without reading. Orwell's message is clear. Without limits, state control destroys truth, freedom, and human dignity. But is every form of surveillance automatically bad? Eastern political thought offers a different answer. Legalist Confucian thinking. Surveillance as stability. In ancient China, alongside Confucianism and Taoism, a strict and practical philosophy rose to power: legalism. It strongly shaped the Chinese state under the Qin dynasty. One of its greatest voices was Han Feizi, and its foundation connects to a more authoritarian, reality-focused version of social control. In this legalist view, human nature tends towards selfishness and disorder. To keep society stable, the state must be strong, centralized, watchful, and ruthless in enforcing laws. Harmony doesn't come from agreement. It comes from discipline and fear of punishment. When the people are weak, the state is strong. When the people are strong, the state is weak. Traditional legalist principle. In this model, surveillance is seen as necessary and even beneficial. People aren't expected to act correctly out of virtue. They behave because they know they'll be punished if they don't. Political and social stability depends on strict laws, constant monitoring, and eliminating anything that threatens control. This kind of thinking still influences modern authoritarian systems that use mass surveillance to maintain political control and public order. The argument is simple. It's better to sacrifice personal freedom than risk collective instability. This perspective clashes with the Western focus on individual rights, but it's important to recognize something. In times of chaos, many people choose order over freedom, even if that means giving up privacy. 3 perspectives, 1 question. These 3 views, Foucault, Orwell, and legalist Confucian thinking, give us a spectrum of interpretations about power and surveillance. Foucault warns us about subtle control. You don't need a dictator to be watched. You just need people to internalize the rules. Orwell shows the nightmare of totalitarianism, where the state crushes humanity to survive. Legalist thinking defends surveillance as a legitimate tool for stability, especially in complex societies. So the central question becomes, how do we balance freedom and security? We live in a world that is more connected and more exposed than ever. We want protection from crime, terrorism, and misinformation. But we also want privacy, autonomy, and dignity. The challenge is making sure control doesn't turn into domination. The tools of surveillance are becoming more advanced. It's no longer just a soldier on the street or a visible camera on a wall. It's an algorithm that knows what you want before you even type it. It's location tracking, app data collection, real-time facial recognition. Today, many people trade privacy for convenience. They accept surveillance in the name of efficiency. But are we giving up freedom for comfort without realizing it? Foucault would say we're being trained and domesticated. Orwell would scream that we're walking toward the edge of a cliff. And legalist philosophy would simply answer, that's how you keep an empire standing. Education is, without question, one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever created. But its true purpose is still deeply debated. Do we educate to free people or to control them? To raise critical thinkers or to shape behavior? To change the world or to train people to fit into the existing order. Throughout history, different thinkers have defended very different roles for education. Three of the most influential are Paulo Freire, Plato, and Confucius. They offer three models: critical, structured, and moral, and by comparing them, we're forced to rethink what teaching is really for and why we do it. Paulo Freire, Education as Liberation. Paulo Freire, a 20th century Brazilian educator and philosopher, is one of the biggest names in critical education. His book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1970, presents a radical alternative to traditional schooling: education as liberation. Freire criticizes what he calls the banking model of education, where teachers deposit knowledge into students as if their minds were empty containers. In this model, the student isn't an active participant in learning. They're a passive object, trained to obey, repeat, and adapt to the system. Education doesn't change the world. Education changes people. People change the world. Paulo Freire. For Freire, education should be an ongoing dialogue, where teacher and student learn together, starting from the student's real-life experience. Through critical awareness, what he calls conscientisation, the individual begins to recognize injustice, question the system, and become someone who can transform society. Freire believed that no education is neutral. It always serves a purpose, either to maintain oppression or to free minds. That's why educators have an ethical and political responsibility: to teach people to read the world, not just words. His ideas influence social movements, public policies, and teaching practices worldwide. But they also face backlash, especially from people who think school should only deliver content, not shape awareness or social thinking. But is building critical awareness enough to maintain social order? Plato believed it wasn't. For him, education must have a clear collective purpose, training citizens to fulfill their role in society. Plato, education as order and social harmony. Plato, a Greek philosopher from the 4th century BC, developed one of the most influential and structured visions of education in history. In the Republic, he argues that education cannot be left to chance. It is the foundation of justice and harmony in the city. Plato believed people are born with different natures. Some are naturally rational and should govern. Others are brave and should protect. Others are productive and should work. The role of education is to discover that inner nature and guide each person to their proper place in society. Education should be such that a person loves what they should love and hates what they should hate. Plato, The Republic. This quote reveals something crucial. For Plato, education isn't only intellectual, it's moral and political. It shapes desire, values, and emotional instincts. The goal isn't simply to create critical individuals, but to form citizens who are disciplined, balanced, and focused on the common good. Plato distrusted unlimited freedom. In a society where everyone wants to do everything, chaos takes over. So education becomes a tool of order. Build just souls, and the city becomes just. His model is hierarchical and elitist. Only the best reach the highest level of philosophical education and become rulers. But he believed this structure protected society from disorder and moral decay. Even today, Plato's influence appears in education systems that emphasize merit, discipline, and the social function of school. Still, many criticize this model for reinforcing inequality and limiting individual freedom. For a different view, one focused on personal morality and social balance, we need to look to Eastern thought, especially Confucius. Confucius, education as moral growth. Confucius, a Chinese thinker from the 5th century BC, deeply believed in the transforming power of education, not as a political weapon, but as a path toward moral improvement and social harmony. For him, the goal of education is to form virtuous people. A good citizen acts with kindness, respect, integrity, and loyalty, and that kind of character is built through study, practice, and tradition. Education creates trust. Trust creates stability. Confucius saw society as a web of relationships between parents and children, rulers and citizens, teachers and students. When everyone fulfills their role with virtue, there is order. And education is what builds that virtue. But unlike Plato, Confucius didn't see education as a way to select the best people for power. He saw it as something universal. In his time, he defended the idea that anyone, even someone poor, could become wise and respected through study. His influence shaped education across Asia for centuries. Respect for teachers, discipline, and hard work are direct legacies of Confucian thinking. Still, the Confucian model can be seen as conservative, since it reinforces hierarchy and traditional values. For Confucius, social change doesn't come from revolt or constant criticism. It comes from self-improvement and moral leadership by example. 3 views. One big question. Paulo Freire believes education should free people from oppression. Plato believes it should guide society toward order. Confucius believes it should shape virtue. These 3 approaches aren't just different, they can actually complement each other, and they lead us to an urgent question. What role should education play in today's world? We live in a time of huge tension, inequality, polarization, moral confusion, and a growing sense of emptiness. Schools often feel stuck between teaching for the job market and teaching for life. Students, in turn, bounce between learning to compete and learning to understand. The answer isn't choosing one model and rejecting the others. It's recognizing that education has to be critical, ethical, and social at the same time. Education today, training or freedom. A school that only teaches formulas, repeats content, and prepares students for tests is much closer to training and obedience than real freedom. An education system that denies students their social role and their ability to think critically ends up reproducing the world exactly as it is. But education that becomes nothing but ideological activism, without depth, without real knowledge, and without ethics, also fails. The challenge of our time is to build an education that shapes the whole person, aware of themselves, others, and the world. An education that develops reason, empathy, responsibility, and freedom. One that combines Freire's critical thinking, Plato's structure, and Confucius's moral foundation. The economy is much more than numbers, charts, or statistics. It determines who has access to basic needs, who gets to shape their future, and most importantly, who pays the price for other people's freedom. Behind every economic system, there is a philosophy, an idea of justice, value, and power. In that context, one of the biggest tensions in society appears: should economic freedom be protected at all costs, or limited in the name of social justice? Can growth and equality exist together? Does the prosperity of some depend on the exclusion of others? 3 thinkers from different times and traditions approach this dilemma in powerful ways: Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Chanakya. Their ideas shaped, and still shape, political systems, government decisions, and the lives of billions of people. Adam Smith. Trust, the freedom of the market. Adam Smith, an 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher, is often called the father of modern capitalism. In his main work, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, he argues that individual economic freedom, the right to produce, sell, invest, and consume without heavy government interference, is the best path to overall prosperity. According to Smith, when people pursue their own interests, they often end up benefiting society as a whole, even if that wasn't their goal. This natural balance between supply and demand became known as the famous invisible hand of the market. It is not from the benevolence of the baker, the butcher, or the brewer that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. Adam Smith. For Smith, the state should interfere as little as possible, mainly to protect property, keep order, and enforce contracts. He believed that a free market encourages innovation, rewards effort, and distributes resources more efficiently than any centralized authority. His vision strongly influenced the Industrial Revolution and economic liberalism, and it still supports many free market policies today. In many places, economic freedom has created growth, jobs, and technological innovation. But Smith also recognized risks, monopolies, exploitation, extreme inequality. He knew the market wasn't perfect, but he still believed its freedom was essential for human progress. The problem begins when that freedom turns into privilege, and when the pursuit of profit ignores the dignity of the people doing the work. That's where Karl Marx enters with a harsh critique. Karl Marx, when freedom becomes exploitation. Karl Marx, a 19th century German philosopher, witnessed the devastating effects of industrial capitalism on working people. He believed that economic freedom was, in reality, the capitalists' freedom to exploit workers, and that the wealth of the few was built on the poverty of the many. For Marx, the issue wasn't just unfair practices, but the structure of the system itself. The means of production belong to a small minority, the bourgeoisie, while the majority, the proletariat, sells their labor for wages that don't reflect the real value they create. The capitalist's freedom is the worker's slavery. A common Marxist critique of economic freedom, paraphrased. Marx argued that as long as production remains private, inequality is inevitable. The state often acts not as a neutral referee, but as a protector of elite economic interests. That's why he called for a complete break, ending capitalism and building a society where the means of production are collectively owned and human labor becomes free and creative. His ideas inspired revolutions, reforms, and social policies around the world. Marx's legacy is visible in labor rights, income redistribution policies, and struggles for social justice. But critics point out that, in practice, regimes that tried to apply Marx's ideas often crushed individual freedoms, created new elites, and failed to produce lasting prosperity. The challenge is finding balance, confronting inequality without falling into economic authoritarianism. Chanakya, the state as a strategic regulator. Between market freedom and social justice, a third path appears. Chanakya, an ancient Indian advisor who argued that the state should play an active role in regulating the economy to protect collective stability. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, was a philosopher, economist, and political strategist in ancient India, 4th century BC. He wrote the Arthashastra, a major work on governance, covering administration, economics, and national security. Unlike Smith, Chanakya didn't trust the market to regulate itself naturally. But unlike Marx, he didn't call for the end of private property. His view was practical. The state must directly intervene in the economy to maintain stability, order, and shared prosperity. Wealth is the foundation of the state's action. Chanakya, Arthashastra. For Chanakya, the government should tax, redistribute, control prices, regulate trade, and step into key industries when necessary. He saw the economy as a tool of public policy, essential to protect the vulnerable and preserve social unity. This kind of model influenced various Asian systems that combine economic development with strong government planning, such as post-war Japan, modern China, or South Korea. These examples show that the state can drive prosperity when it acts with wisdom, ethics, and long-term vision. But this approach also demands caution. A state that becomes too powerful can crush individual initiative, and too much regulation can lead to corruption or economic stagnation. 3 views, 1 big question. Adam Smith trusts market freedom. Karl Marx exposes the injustice hidden inside that freedom. Chanakya looks for balance between state order and collective well-being. Each one offers a different way to answer the same dilemma. How do we organize the economy in a way that is fair, efficient, and human? In today's world, we still see these 3 forces clashing. Countries that rely heavily on free markets face growing inequality. Regimes that try to eliminate capitalism often limited freedom. And state-planned models, even when successful, can become authoritarian or inefficient if poorly managed. The truth is, There's no single perfect formula, but there are core principles that should guide any choice: human dignity, real opportunity for everyone, and a balance between freedom and responsibility. And today, where are we now? In the 21st century, the tension between economic freedom and social justice shows up in new ways. The digital economy creates billionaires in just a few years, while workers face unstable jobs, automation, and growing insecurity. At the same time, the climate crisis demands more sustainable and collective production models. And the recent pandemic exposed, in a brutal way, how fragile systems become when they rely only on the market. Because of that, the debate between Smith, Marx, and Chanakya is back at full strength. How do we protect freedom without creating exclusion? How do we build prosperity without permanent inequality? How do we balance individual ambition with social responsibility? Few parts of human life have been as regulated, watched, and judged throughout history as sexuality. It can be an expression of freedom and a target of control at the same time, a source of pleasure and a reason for repression, something natural and something shaped by culture. That's why talking about sexual freedom and social norms means touching one of the most sensitive points in the relationship between the individual and society. Sexuality is not just biological, it is deeply political, ethical, and philosophical. It reveals the tension between desire and duty, spontaneity and morality, personal freedom and power structures. Three perspectives help shed light on this dilemma: Simone de Beauvoir, with her feminist critique of controlling women's bodies; Aristotle, with his defense of moderation in the name of civic order; and Taoism, with its fluid and poetic view of sexuality as something that can exist in harmony with nature. Simone de Beauvoir, Sexual Freedom as Liberation. Simone de Beauvoir, a 20th century French philosopher, is one of the major voices in existentialist philosophy and feminist thought. In her groundbreaking book, The Second Sex, 1949, she explains how women have historically been defined not as themselves, but in relation to men, as the other, the secondary one. One of the main forms of oppression, according to Beauvoir, is the control of female sexuality. For centuries, women were expected to embody chastity, modesty, and purity, and any behavior outside those rules was seen as a threat to morality, family, and society. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. Simone de Beauvoir. This powerful line shows that feminine identity, and the sexuality tied to it, is socially constructed. The repression of women's sexual freedom is not natural. It comes from a system that fears women as free, autonomous, and capable of desire. For Beauvoir, sexual freedom is not just about lifestyle or personal choices. It is about existential emancipation. A woman can only be truly free when she has control over her own body, her own desire, and her own sexual expression, without being shamed or treated as inferior for it. Her ideas inspired movements for sexual liberation, resistance against gender-based violence, and challenges to the social rules that still define what is acceptable or decent for women. But some people view total freedom with concern. If desire has no limits, does it threaten social stability? To explore that question, we can look to classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, who believed order was the foundation of life in a community. Aristotle, moderation as a form of order. Aristotle, a Greek philosopher from the 4th century BC, was not a moralist in a religious sense, but he believed that virtue is found in balance. In Nicomachean Ethics, he introduces the idea of the golden mean, virtue as the middle point between extremes, not too much, not too little. That logic also applies to sexuality. For Aristotle, desire is a natural part of being human, but if it is lived without moderation, it can become harmful to both the individual and society. The virtuous person is the one who finds the middle ground between extremes. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. The city, the polis, depends on order, and the good life is guided by reason and self-control. Too much freedom, including sexual freedom, could corrupt the soul and destabilize collective life, leading to pure pleasure-seeking, weakened family structure, and a loss of focus on higher virtues. Aristotle didn't condemn pleasure, but he believed pleasure should be ruled by reason. So sexual freedom, while legitimate, should be lived with discipline and responsibility, so it contributes to a good life, not moral decline. His perspective still influences many traditional views that support limits and norms around desire, not always as repression, but as protection for social and family stability. But there's another way to see this entire conflict, not as a battle between freedom and order, but as a search for harmony with nature. That's the view offered by Taoism. Taoism, sexuality as a natural flow. Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophy linked to Laozi and Zhuangzi, offers a unique view of freedom, including sexual freedom. At the center of Taoism is the Tao, or Tao, the natural path, the invisible flow of existence that runs through everything. For Taoism, living well means living in harmony with the Tao, which means not forcing, not repressing, and not fighting what is natural. Sexual desire, in that context, isn't a sin or a threat. It is a legitimate expression of life itself. The wise person is like water. It flows without resistance and adapts without effort. Laozi, Tao Te Ching. Sexuality, when lived in balance with the body and nature, becomes a source of vitality, connection, and calm. The problem isn't desire itself, it's excess or repression, both of which disrupt the natural flow of life energy. Unlike systems that impose strict rules on the body and pleasure, Taoism teaches that real freedom is internal. It appears when a person learns to listen to their own nature, stops being trapped by external judgment, and lives desire with simplicity and respect. This philosophy has inspired practices like the Tao of Love, sexual energy cultivation, and a more holistic view of the relationship between body, spirit, and pleasure. It's not a war between desire and reason, it's more like a dance between them, a subtle balance that isn't forced, but lived. 3 perspectives, 1 deep tension. Simone de Beauvoir demands that women take back control of their bodies and desires. Aristotle argues that reason must guide pleasure to protect civic order. Taoism invites people to follow the natural flow of desire with balance and detachment. These perspectives show that sexual freedom is never simple or neutral. It always interacts with social expectations, moral values, cultural models, and spirituality. Today we live in a world where sexuality is more visible, more discussed, and more diverse, but also more monitored, more judged, and more politicized. The internet gave desire a voice, but also created new forms of control. Sexual freedom has expanded in many places, but it has also triggered conservative backlash that tries to suppress those changes. So the question remains, where is the line between freedom and disorder? Between repression and responsibility? Technology promised us freedom, more time, more comfort, more information, more choices. But did it really deliver what it promised? Or did it simply improve older forms of control, making them more subtle and more efficient? We live in an era where technology is everywhere. It connects us, organizes us, entertains us, educates us, and even watches over us for our own good. But as algorithms grow stronger, digital surveillance expands, and our dependence on devices increases, an urgent dilemma appears. Are we more free or more controlled than ever? 3 philosophical perspectives can help us explore this tension. Herbert Marcuse's critique, Yuval Noah Harari's modern warning, and Zen Buddhism's call to turn inward. Together, these views reveal the contradictions, risks, and maybe even the path toward a better relationship between humans and machines. Herbert Marcuse, comfort as a new form of domination. Herbert Marcuse, a 20th century German philosopher and member of the Frankfurt School, did not see technology as evil by nature. Instead, he saw it as an ideological tool, a form of domination disguised as progress. In One-Dimensional Man, 1964, he argues that advanced industrial society created a type of control that doesn't rely on fear but on comfort. Technology serves as a more effective instrument of domination the more it is accepted. Herbert Marcuse. For Marcuse, modern technology standardizes thinking, blocks criticism, and creates an illusion of freedom. People become satisfied consumers who adapt to the system, but struggle to imagine any real alternatives. Even language becomes technical, shallow, and functional, losing its deeper critical power. According to him, technical progress begins to define what counts as rational and efficient, while deeper human needs, like freedom, art, reflection, and revolution, get treated as useless or unrealistic. Marcuse wasn't against technology itself. He was against the way it gets used to strengthen an oppressive social order, turning human beings into parts of an automated machine. Instead of unlocking human potential, technology starts to tame the mind, creating a one-dimensional person, someone who can't move beyond the system that keeps them trapped. This critique feels even more relevant today. Social media often tells people what to think. Algorithms shape desire. Digital systems make choices on our behalf. So the question becomes, are we using technology, or is technology using us? Yuval Noah Harari, Data as the New Power. Yuval Noah Harari, a historian and best-selling author of Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, offers a more modern and equally unsettling view of how technology threatens freedom. For Harari, the biggest danger of the 21st century isn't armed oppression, but total surveillance powered by data. In a world where everything can be tracked, heartbeats, location, facial expressions, shopping habits, individual freedom can become irrelevant compared to the accuracy of algorithms. Humans are becoming hackable. All you need is enough biometric, behavioral, and psychological data. Yuval Noah Harari. In other words, whoever controls the data can predict and influence behavior. That means governments, corporations, and AI systems may start deciding before us, and instead of us. Harari warns that we are entering a new form of power, more efficient than any dictatorship of the past. Instead of banning or punishing, algorithms simply guide what we want, show us specific options, and keep us busy with what feels good. And that can be enough to keep people obedient, calm, and satisfied. The most disturbing part is that surveillance doesn't even need to be noticed to work. It can be invisible, friendly, and built into the devices we love most. And the biggest danger isn't only what technology can do to us, it's how much we are willing to give away voluntarily in exchange for convenience and security. After Marcuse and Harari, it can feel like the future is dark, a digital prison with invisible walls. But there is a third perspective that invites a pause, a return inward, and a reconnection with what makes us human: Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism. Freedom begins. Inside Zen, a school of Buddhism that grew strongly in Japan, teaches that real freedom doesn't depend on external conditions, technology, or institutions. It comes from letting go of attachment, to ego, to desire, and to the illusions of the mind. True freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's not being controlled by wanting. Traditional Zen teaching. For Zen, the problem isn't technology itself. The problem is our attachment to it, our dependence on constant desire, distraction, and performance. Instead of fighting the outer system, Zen practice teaches you to observe your inner life, quiet your mind, and stay present. Meditation, silence, and the act of simply sitting, zazen, become forms of resistance against the chaos and hyperactivity of modern life. In today's world, Zen can be seen as a way to reclaim mental autonomy. Everything around us pushes outward. Notifications, stimulation, deadlines, goals. Zen calls us back inward. And there, in a space no machine can truly enter, we may find a deeper kind of freedom, unconditional and real. One problem, 3 warnings. Marcuse shows that technology may look neutral, but often serves a system of disguised domination. Harari warns that data is the new currency of power, and we could lose freedom without even noticing. Zen Buddhism reminds us that freedom begins inside, by quieting the ego and letting go of compulsive desire. These perspectives don't cancel each other out. They complete each other. Together, they point to an urgent need for awareness in how we relate to technology. This isn't about accepting or rejecting progress. It's about asking, what kind of freedom do we want to protect? And what are we willing to sacrifice for it? Today's world, connected but free. Today, our lives move through screens. What we eat, what we buy, who we talk to, what we feel. Everything passes through digital filters. There's no going back. Technology won't be uninvented, but it can be redefined. For that, we need critical awareness, as Marcuse argues. We need understanding of data power, as Harari warns, and we need self-control, silence, and simplicity, as Zen teaches. Without that combination, the risk is real, losing ourselves inside the machines we built, not through a sudden technological revolution, but through a slow, unconscious surrender to distraction, overload, and digital alienation. Which path should we choose? The question isn't technological, it's philosophical. What does it mean to be free in an era of constant connection? Freedom isn't just having choices on a screen. It's knowing who is making the choices. It's being able to unplug, pause, and think, without fear that you're missing something. Maybe the real revolution is this, not letting machines decide what it means to be human. What does it mean to be free? Is it doing whatever you want, following your heart, obeying a law, or quieting the ego? Freedom is a value we celebrate, but we don't always understand it, especially when it comes to ethics. In that case, freedom stops being just having choices and becomes something deeper, the responsibility to do what's right, even when it goes against our strongest impulses. Three major thinkers, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and the Buddha, offer different ways to connect freedom and morality. For Kant, true freedom means obeying moral reason. For Hume, morality is built on feeling and empathy. For the Buddha, inner freedom requires balance, compassion, and ethical discipline. Together, they show us something powerful. Being free isn't doing everything you want. It's learning to want what is right. Immanuel Kant, freedom as moral autonomy. Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher, transformed ethics with a radical idea. Being free isn't following desire. It's acting according to a moral law that comes from reason itself. In Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, 1785, Kant argues that if our actions are guided only by impulses, emotions, or personal interest, then we're not truly free. We're just being pushed around by desire and circumstance. True freedom requires moral autonomy, the ability to act out of duty, not convenience. Freedom is the independence of the will from the influence of sensible desires. Immanuel Kant. This idea becomes concrete in his famous categorical imperative. Act only according to a rule that you could will to become a universal law. In other words, before acting, ask yourself if what you're doing could become a rule for everyone. Would lying be acceptable if everyone lied? Would exploiting others be fair if everyone did it? For Kant, morality is about rational consistency and respect for human dignity. A person must never be treated as a tool for your goals. Every human being is an end in themselves. This approach demands discipline and courage, because what is moral isn't always what feels good in the moment. But for Kant, it's exactly when we act against selfish desire, out of respect for reason, that we become truly free. Still, Kant's strict moral vision has often been criticized for sounding cold or unrealistic. That's where David Hume comes in, with a more human and emotional approach. Morality begins with feeling. David Hume. Morality comes from empathy. David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, strongly disagreed with Kant. For him, reason is not the master of human life. It serves passion. Morality can't be proved like a math problem. The foundation of ethics is not pure logic, but moral feeling, especially empathy. In a treatise of human nature, Hume argues that we judge actions as good or bad not through rational calculation, but through emotional reactions. When we see someone suffering, we feel pain. When we see kindness, we feel warmth. This natural sympathy is what creates moral values. It is only from sentiment that the distinction between good and evil can arise. David Hume. For Hume, morality is a social creation formed through relationships, habit, and shared sensitivity. Social order is maintained not by abstract rules, but by common values, a collective sense of justice and compassion. He admits that reason matters, but only to organize and apply feelings, not to create them. You don't need logic to know torture is wrong. You only need to feel it. This makes ethics feel closer to real life, grounded in emotion and human experience. But it also raises a serious risk. Feelings can be manipulated, distorted, or numbed. What happens when we lose empathy? When desire completely takes over the mind? That's where the Buddha's teaching becomes essential. The Buddha, freedom through awareness and self-mastery. Siddhartha. Gautama, the Buddha, lived in India over 2,500 years ago and taught a path of inner liberation built on ethics, awareness, and balance. For him, human suffering comes from attachment to desire, and real freedom is only possible when we break the illusion of the ego. Buddhism does not teach obedience to external laws or blind dependence on momentary feeling. Instead, it teaches the middle way, avoiding both extreme pleasure-seeking and extreme self-denial, living with mindfulness, compassion, and moderation. To conquer yourself is greater than to conquer 1,000 battles. Buddhist morality is expressed through simple guidelines. Don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't intoxicate yourself, don't live in uncontrolled lust. But these aren't rules forced from the outside. They are tools to train the mind and purify the heart. In Buddhism, ethics is practice. It's awareness. It's wisdom applied to everyday life. The goal is not obedience, but enlightenment, a state of inner freedom where a person is no longer controlled by impulses, fear, or ego. This speaks strongly to the modern world, shaped by anxiety, excess, and shallow distractions. Buddhism invites us to slow down, observe, breathe, and realize that real freedom isn't doing everything, but not needing everything. 3 lenses, 1 core truth. Kant presents ethics as rational duty. Hume sees morality as born from empathy. The Buddha points to freedom from desire through awareness. Each one offers a different lens, but they all touch the same truth. Freedom is not the absence of limits. It's an inner achievement. Being free isn't doing whatever you want. It's living with responsibility, awareness, and compassion. These perspectives may look different, but they can work together. Kant reminds us to stay consistent and morally clear. Hume reconnects us with emotional truth and human sensitivity. The Buddha teaches self-control and inner peace. Moral freedom, in this sense, isn't a gift. It's something you build, a daily practice that requires reflection, empathy, and discipline. And what about today? We live in a time when the line between right and wrong is constantly debated. Social media speeds up judgment, emotions rise fast, and reason often gets drowned out. In that chaos, what does it mean to be ethical, to be free, to act with awareness? Kant's view can feel strict, but it's needed in a world where values are being watered down. Hume's approach makes us more human, but it requires alertness against manipulation. The Buddha's teaching calms us, but it also challenges us to look inward honestly. Maybe true ethical freedom is learning to cultivate all 3 forces: reason, empathy, and awareness. To act with moral clarity, living compassion, and an awake mind. Freedom and order. 2 ideas that are essential to life in society, but that often collide. In stable times, freedom grows. But when fear takes over, through crises, wars, pandemics, or institutional collapse, order steps in. And with it, freedom often pulls back. So the real question becomes, how much freedom can we lose in the name of order? And how much order can we risk in the name of freedom? This political tension runs through centuries of history and is still alive today, in democracies, authoritarian regimes, and the grey zones in between. Three thinkers, Hannah Arendt, Machiavelli, and Sun Tzu, offer powerful insights into the risks, strategies, and consequences of choosing between political freedom and authoritarian order. Hannah Arendt, Totalitarianism as the Destruction of Freedom. Hannah Arendt, a 20th century political philosopher, devoted much of her work to analyzing extreme forms of power, especially totalitarianism. In her groundbreaking book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, she studies the regimes of Hitler and Stalin, showing how political systems can destroy freedom not only physically, but existentially. For Arendt, totalitarianism is not just a brutal dictatorship, it's a system where the individual loses the ability to think, act, and choose. People are reduced to blind obedience, not only through force, but through isolation, propaganda, and the destruction of public spaces for debate. What makes man a political being is his capacity to act together with others. Hannah Arendt. Political freedom, for her, is born through dialogue, diversity, and collective action. It only exists when there is a public space where different voices can meet, disagree, and create something new. When that space disappears, replaced by uniform fear and rigid ideology, politics turns into domination, and the individual becomes an anonymous part of the machine. Arendt warns that totalitarianism doesn't begin with tanks in the streets. It begins with indifference, apathy, and silence as people slowly lose their freedoms little by little. Her work is a warning. Defending political freedom requires active participation, critical thinking, and moral courage. But what happens when freedom seems to threaten the stability of the state itself? That's where Machiavelli enters with a more pragmatic view. Machiavelli, order as survival. Niccolo. Machiavelli, a 16th century Italian Renaissance thinker, wrote about power as it really is, not as it should be. His most famous book, The Prince, 1513, became a symbol of political realism, a world where traditional morality doesn't always work in the art of governing. Machiavelli believed that keeping the state stable and secure was more important than abstract ideals of freedom or virtue. A ruler, he argued, must be clever like a fox and strong like a lion, willing to make hard decisions when needed. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But for Machiavelli, the prince for Machiavelli, in times of crisis, freedom can, and sometimes must, be sacrificed for the survival of the state. He doesn't celebrate tyranny, but he recognizes that politics often involves tragic choices, where kindness can be useless and force becomes unavoidable. His thinking has shaped leaders throughout history, especially during unstable periods. Even today, many leaders still use this argument. We need control now so we can have freedom later. But the problem is that later doesn't always come. The exception becomes the rule, and freedom becomes a promise that keeps getting delayed. Machiavelli forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Justice and freedom don't always guarantee order, but he also leaves us with an ethical question. What are the limits of legitimate force? And can power built on repression truly last? This tension between strategy and ethics also appears in Eastern thought, especially in the lessons of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu, strength through wisdom, not constant force. Sun Tzu, a Chinese general and philosopher from around the 5th century BC, wrote The Art of War, one of the most influential books ever written about strategy, power, and leadership. While it focuses on warfare, its lessons extend to politics, economics, and everyday life. Unlike Arendt, who sees authoritarianism as the destruction of freedom, and Machiavelli, who accepts harsh sacrifices for order, Sun Tzu offers a more flexible and adaptive approach. For him, real strength is not rigid control, it's the ability to move with circumstances. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Sun Tzu, The Art of War Order, in Sun Tzu's view, should be smart, strategic, and quiet. A good leader doesn't need constant force. They win through anticipation, knowledge, and wisdom. Freedom, on the other hand, isn't absolute chaos. It's the ability to act with flexibility, without being trapped by fixed rules. A good general, or a good leader, doesn't apply rules blindly. They read the moment, the environment, and the forces at play. This raises an important thought. Is authoritarian order really necessary, or is it just a strategic failure? Sun Tzu reminds us that too much rigidity is weakness pretending to be strength. True authority doesn't crush people. It guides them. It doesn't suffocate. It directs. Freedom and order, enemies or allies. Arendt shows us the terror of blind obedience. Machiavelli warns us about the danger of political naivety. Sun Tzu teaches that lasting order comes from wisdom, not oppression. These three voices reveal that the conflict between political freedom and authoritarian order has no simple answer. Freedom without responsibility can create chaos. Order without freedom can create tyranny. The real challenge is building an order that protects freedom, and a freedom that does not destroy order. That requires ethical leaders, aware citizens, and strong institutions. It also requires constant vigilance, because authoritarianism rarely arrives with tanks. It arrives with promises of safety, urgent speeches, and temporary emergency measures. In our time, political freedom faces more subtle threats. Hidden censorship on social media, the weakening of parliaments and institutions, fear being used to justify emergency powers. Mass indifference as surveillance expands. Arendt would see these signs as a flashing red warning. Machiavelli would remind us that sometimes the price of freedom is instability. Sun Tzu would suggest watching closely, listening carefully, and acting wisely before conflict becomes unavoidable. In a society shaped by standards, norms, and group expectations, being different is a challenge. In many places, freedom is celebrated. But in real life, being different is still a reason people get excluded, judged, or pushed down. The freedom to be different may be the purest and the riskiest kind of freedom. Being different doesn't just mean thinking outside the box or having unique tastes. It means daring to be who you truly are, even when that goes against the dominant moral code, social customs, or your need to be accepted. That courage to fully exist is the central theme of three major thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Laozi. Each one, in their own way, invites us to reflect on what it means to be an individual surrounded by the crowd, how heavy authenticity can feel in a world that prefers copies, and what it really means to be free in your own uniqueness. Nietzsche. The individual against the herd. Friedrich Nietzsche, a 19th century German philosopher, is one of the strongest voices in defense of the individual against collective morality. In works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and On the Genealogy of Morality, he attacks what he calls herd morality, a system of values built to keep everyone the same, pulling people down and repressing individual greatness. Become who you are. Nietzsche, the gay science for Nietzsche, society tends to reward conformity, obedience, and mediocrity. People who stand out, think differently, and create their own values often face suspicion or hostility. He calls these rare people free spirits, or the Overman, Übermensch, individuals who don't just follow the morals of their time, but create their own ethics, rooted in life, strength, and self-affirmation. So being different isn't empty rebellion. It's creative. It's saying yes to your own will, even if it clashes with everything considered normal. Nietzsche doesn't romanticize this path. He knows freedom has a cost, loneliness, misunderstanding, criticism. But he believes human greatness lives exactly in this ability to carry the weight of freedom. That message feels extremely current in an age where social standards are becoming even stricter, even when they're disguised as freedom. The pressure to fit in, to please, to perform is still real. And Nietzsche reminds us, being authentic is an act of courage and creation. But this radical freedom, if it isn't balanced with responsibility, can turn into selfishness or carelessness. That's where existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre comes in. Sartre, freedom with total responsibility. Jean-Paul Sartre, a 20th century French philosopher and key figure in existentialism, agrees with Nietzsche about how central freedom is. But he goes further. For Sartre, being free also means taking total responsibility for yourself and for the world. In Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre says that man is condemned to be free. In other words, humans don't have a fixed essence or a predetermined destiny. We define ourselves through our choices. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Jean-Paul Sartre. That freedom isn't comfortable. It's stressful, because when you choose, you don't just define yourself, you also send the world a message about how you believe people should live. Every action carries the weight of an example. You can't blame others, society, God, or destiny. You're fully responsible for what you become. Sartre also makes one thing clear. Freedom can't be used as an excuse for selfishness. Authenticity requires recognizing that we live in relationship with other people. So being different doesn't mean ignoring the crowd. It means facing it with honesty. Freedom becomes an ethical challenge, a demand to be real, even when nobody understands. A commitment to your own truth, without excuses, without masks. But how do you balance authenticity and harmony? How do you stay free without going to war with everything around you? That's where Laozi offers a different answer, quieter, more fluid. Laozi. Being different without forcing it. Laozi, the founder of Taoism and author of the classic Tao Te Ching, lived in China around the 6th century BC. His philosophy doesn't praise power, conflict, or forcing your will. Instead, it teaches that real strength comes from softness, flexibility, and not resisting life. Those who bend will be strong, those who yield will endure. Laozi, Tao Te Ching. For Laozi, freedom isn't about pushing your difference onto the world. It's about flowing through the world without losing who you are. The wise person doesn't fight the current, but they also don't disappear inside it. They stay whole by following the Tao, the natural flow of life. To Laozi, being different isn't confrontation. It's deep awareness. It's living in harmony with nature, cycles, and reality, without forcing, resisting, or trying to dominate. That may seem passive from a Western point of view, but it holds a deep kind of wisdom. Real freedom is not being controlled by the system or by your ego. It's knowing when to act and when to step back. It's staying loyal to yourself without needing to prove anything to anyone. In a world obsessed with competition, speed, and constant self-promotion, Laozi invites us to be lighter, quieter, and peacefully authentic. You don't need to scream to be different. You just need to not betray yourself. 3 paths, 1 challenge. Nietzsche calls you to affirm your difference against the crowd. Sartre demands you choose with courage and responsibility. Laozi teaches you to live your difference in harmony with the world. 3 ways of thinking about the freedom to be different, and 3 answers to the same question. How do you live authentically in a society that pressures you to conform? Society promotes ready-made models of success, beauty, behavior, and thought. But the freedom to be different isn't just resisting those models. It's building your own path with responsibility, awareness, and humility. And today, being different is still a risk. In today's world, being different seems more accepted, but the pressure to belong is stronger than ever. Social media creates patterns of behavior and image that promise freedom, but demand constant approval. Cancel culture discourages disagreement. The market absorbs difference and turns it into a product. Truly being different is still political, ethical, and existential. Nietzsche would warn you, herd morality still exists, now dressed up as freedom. Sartre would remind you, Being free means choosing and carrying the weight of that choice. Laozi would whisper, "Don't fight to be different, just be, lightly." We're surrounded by information, notifications, headlines, short videos, posts, and comments pile up in front of us every single day. The promise of the digital age was simple: more access to information, more freedom of speech, more power for the individual. But what we see today is far more complicated. Information doesn't just set you free. It can also manipulate, polarize, and numb you. It has never been easier to form an opinion, and never been harder to know if that opinion is truly yours. Behind the constant stream of content, there are filters, interests, and algorithms shaping what we see, what we know, and even what we believe is true. And that brings up a crucial question. Is public opinion still free? Or has it become just another tool of control? To understand this dilemma, we can look through the ideas of Noam Chomsky, who exposes the manipulative role of media, Alexis de Tocqueville, who warns about the danger of majority tyranny in democracies, and Nagarjuna, a Buddhist philosopher who pushes us to question our attachment to fixed truths. Together, these thinkers help us see how media and public opinion shape and limit our freedom. Noam Chomsky, Media as Manufactured Consent. Noam Chomsky, a modern linguist and political activist, is one of the strongest critics of the role media plays in modern democracies. In his classic book Manufacturing Consent, 1988, written with Edward S. Herman, Chomsky argues that major media outlets don't simply inform people, they condition them. Instead of presenting facts in a neutral way, media filters reality according to the political and economic interests of dominant groups. Propaganda is to democracy what violence is to dictatorship. Noam Chomsky. That quote captures his point. In dictatorships, control is built through force. In democracies, it often happens through controlling information. According to Chomsky, the media creates a manufactured consensus. It decides which topics matter, which voices are heard, and which stories are allowed. Behind that, he describes 5 main filters. Who owns the media? Usually large corporations. Dependence on advertising. Close ties to official sources. Attacks on dissenting voices. An anti-communist ideology, or any enemy narrative that justifies excluding alternative views. In practice, this means the average person may not be forming opinions freely, but instead building opinions from a pre-selected menu of what can be thought, said, and debated. Chomsky isn't calling for censorship. He's exposing a kind of censorship that hides behind the idea of freedom. In a world where everything seems available, the real challenge is figuring out what's real, what's manipulated, and what got silenced before it even had a chance to exist. Alexis de Tocqueville, The Tyranny of the Majority. But the problem doesn't stop there. Even when there is freedom of the press and many different opinions, public opinion itself can become oppressive. That's what Alexis de Tocqueville warns about. Tocqueville, a 19th century French thinker, closely studied American democracy and published his analysis in Democracy in America. He believed democracy had huge potential, but he also pointed out its internal dangers, especially the tyranny of the majority. The majority has the taste and the power to act like an absolute ruler. Tocqueville, Democracy in America. For Tocqueville, the biggest threat to democracy isn't a king's dictatorship. It's when the majority's opinion starts crushing minorities, silencing differences, and destroying individuality. In this case, freedom isn't taken by force. It's taken through social pressure and the fear of being rejected. You can clearly see this today on social media, where the pressure to follow certain views can feel just as oppressive as official censorship. People who think differently get mocked, cancelled, or pushed into silence. Freedom of speech, which sounds great in theory, starts to disappear in real life when fear becomes stronger than the courage to think freely. Tocqueville understood that if you want to protect freedom in a democracy, you have to protect dissenters, minorities, and unpopular opinions. Otherwise, democracy turns into conformity, where pluralism is only an illusion and freedom becomes a performance. Nagarjuna. Letting go of absolute truth. So is there a way out of this trap of rigid opinions and absolute narratives? Maybe the answer is learning to loosen our grip on the idea that our beliefs are unchangeable truths. That's where Nagarjuna comes in, one of the greatest minds of Mahayana Buddhism. Nagarjuna, an Indian philosopher from the 2nd century, is considered the father of the Madhyamaka school, or the middle way. His core idea is that everything is empty of a fixed, permanent essence, including our opinions. Clinging to any view is a prison. Letting go of all views is freedom. Nagarjuna. For Nagarjuna, the main problem of the human mind is attachment to fixed concepts, absolute views about the world. That attachment creates suffering, ignorance, and illusions of certainty. Even when we think we're right, that confidence might just be another layer of illusion. When we apply this to media and public opinion, we learn something important. It's not just the media that manipulates us. We also cling to the stories that comfort us. Our biases, fears, and identities shape what we choose to believe. According to Nagarjuna, real freedom isn't about having the right opinion. It's about having enough wisdom to see that opinions are temporary, imperfect, and limited. That doesn't mean falling into extreme relativism, where everything is the same. It means living with the awareness that human knowledge is always incomplete, and that compassion matters more than certainty. This kind of detachment frees us from ideological arrogance, fanaticism, and division. It helps us listen, learn, and change. And maybe that's exactly what public debate needs today. Less yelling, more listening, less certainty, more reflection. What these 3 thinkers teach us. Chomsky warns us, freedom of speech can be an illusion when media serves power. Tocqueville warns us, even in democracy, public opinion can crush individual freedom. Nagarjuna teaches us, real freedom begins when we stop clinging to absolute truth. Together, they reveal one of the deepest challenges of our time. How do we build a freedom that isn't manipulated, isn't tyrannical, and isn't trapped in illusion? Maybe the answer lies in 3 attitudes. Critical awareness, to question sources and hidden interests behind information. Chomsky, protection of diversity, so different voices can exist and truly debate. Tocqueville, detachment and intellectual humility, so we don't become prisoners of our own certainty. Nagarjuna. And today, we've never been more informed, and yet we've rarely been more divided, impatient, and extreme. Freedom of expression is threatened not only by governments, but by polarization, algorithms, and the rush to judge. Being free today takes more than just saying what you think. It means thinking before speaking. It means listening with an open mind. And it means having the courage to change your mind. Freedom is often seen as something external, the ability to act, speak, and move through life without obstacles. But there's another kind of freedom that is more subtle, deeper, and maybe even harder to achieve. Inner freedom, being free on the inside, being at peace with yourself, living without being enslaved by desires, impulses, fears, or illusions. In a world that keeps getting faster, louder, and more chaotic, spiritual freedom becomes a rare treasure, and many people eventually realize that it doesn't matter how much they've achieved on the outside. If the chaos inside still remains, freedom will always feel incomplete. 3 masters of philosophy and spirituality, Augustine of Hippo, Spinoza, and Patanjali, offer powerful answers for this search for inner freedom. Each one, in their own way, says the same thing. True freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's finding the inner order that frees you from yourself. Augustine of Hippo. Freedom through God. Augustine, a Christian philosopher and theologian from the 4th century, lived an intense spiritual journey. He moved from chasing pleasure and knowledge to fully surrendering to faith. In his book Confessions, he describes his inner struggle and how he discovered that uncontrolled free will didn't lead him to freedom. It led him to slavery through sin. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Augustine, Confessions. For Augustine, Human beings do have free will, but we are only truly free when we choose the highest good, God. Acting only based on personal desire, without direction or meaning, becomes a trap of pride, vanity, and ego. So freedom, in his view, isn't doing everything you want. It's wanting what is good, just, and true. Augustine believed that human will was damaged by original sin. Without divine grace, we can't fully choose the good on our own. Inner order, then, comes from humility, admitting our weakness and aligning the soul with God's will. To modern ears, this can sound strict, but there's a deep spiritual truth behind it. A lot of what we call freedom is really just attachment in disguise. Augustine invites us to look inward and notice that there's a restlessness that only ends when the ego surrenders to something greater than itself. Spinoza, freedom through understanding. Baruch. Spinoza, a 17th century Dutch philosopher, also spoke about God, but not as a personal being. For him, God is the totality of nature, the infinite substance expressed in everything that exists. Spinoza believed that everything in the universe happens by necessity. Everything has a cause. For him, the idea of free will as total personal choice is an illusion created by ignorance. The free person is the one who lives according to reason. Itiamzi, Spinoza, Ethics. According to Spinoza, when we don't understand why we feel what we feel or why we do what we do, we think we're acting freely. But in reality, we're being pulled around by passions, impulses, and external forces. So real freedom doesn't mean escaping necessity. It means understanding it. When you understand what drives you, biologically, emotionally, socially, even spiritually, you stop acting on impulse and start acting with clarity. Freedom becomes a state of awareness, an inner order built through reason and lucidity. This view might sound cold at first, but it offers a powerful key. When you stop reacting blindly to life and start understanding it calmly, you gain power over yourself. Spinoza teaches a freedom without illusions, a freedom built through maturity. The more you understand the connections of life, the more you act in line with your true nature, and the more free you become. Patanjali. Freedom through stillness. But what if freedom doesn't come through reason, but through direct experience, inner practice? That's where Patanjali, one of the most important figures in the yoga tradition, comes in. Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, teaches that spiritual freedom, called Kaivalya, is the highest state of liberation from the mind and the ego. But that kind of freedom doesn't happen automatically. It takes practice, discipline, and purification of awareness. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Patanjali, Yoga Sutras 1.2. Patanjali explains that the human mind is constantly disturbed by thoughts, cravings, memories, and expectations. Those mental waves keep us trapped in cycles of suffering, anxiety, and illusion. Yoga, in the philosophical sense, not just the physical one, exists to calm this inner storm and reconnect us with a deeper state of peace. This inner liberation requires two things: abhyasa, consistent practice, vairagya, detachment. It's a path that demands effort, watching the ego, observing habits, meditating, cultivating silence, and living ethically. Unlike Augustine, who speaks of surrendering to God, or Spinoza, who speaks of rational understanding, Patanjali speaks of direct experience of the self, a freedom that doesn't come from knowing more, but from needing less. Inner order here isn't moral control, it's deep balance. Freedom means no longer needing the world to feel whole. 3 paths, 1 direction. Augustine says, surrender to God and find peace. Spinoza says, understand the causes and become free. Patanjali says, calm the mind and dissolve the ego. Different paths, same direction. Real freedom isn't outside you, it's inside you. It's not something you conquer by force. It's something that shows up when inner order finally takes root. These ideas challenge modern thinking, which often connects freedom with endless choices, constant consumption, radical independence, or having no limits. But what these masters reveal is that this kind of freedom can easily become a new prison, built out of desire, distraction, and illusion. Spiritual freedom is different. It's quiet, deep, stable. It grows out of order, not chaos. Out of awareness, not impulse. Out of detachment, not possession. And the world today? In a hyper-connected world full of noise and stimulation, protecting inner order is an act of resistance. We're hit non-stop with opinions, comparisons, pressure, and anxiety. We live with the feeling that we're always behind, always failing, always missing something, even when we don't know what. That's why this final lesson matters so much. Because without inner freedom, every other freedom becomes fragile. Without inner silence, every search becomes noise. Augustine reminds us that the soul longs for something eternal. Spinoza invites us to understand the web of life with clarity. Patanjali teaches us to quiet the mind and return to what matters most. Maybe the greatest freedom is this: not needing to prove anything anymore. Not to the world, and not even to yourself. If you made it this far, thank you for taking the time to go on this philosophical journey with us. Freedom, whether political, spiritual, individual, or collective, isn't a ready-made answer. It's an ongoing search, a daily practice of reflection, courage, and awareness. And if you're here right now, thinking along with us and questioning the world, you're already on the path. Now we'd love to invite you to keep being part of this space for thought, critique, and transformation. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, where we go even deeper into these and other fundamental questions about existence. Like this video if it made you reflect in any way. Comment down below, which of these ideas hit you the hardest? And which philosopher best represents your view of freedom? And of course, share this with someone you think needs to hear it. A friend, a co-worker, or anyone searching for a freer and deeper way to think. Here on this channel, philosophy isn't distant. It's alive, relevant, and necessary. Stick around, explore the other videos, and keep walking with us on this journey toward more awareness, wisdom, and inner freedom. See you next time.